Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Salvador Munoz, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at Poster House, the first and only museum in the United States dedicated to the art and history of the poster. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our very first in-person public program since the pandemic. Thank you all, and please echo that round of applause back to yourselves for making it here today, because these programs can't happen without the public. So tonight's program at the Grindhouse with Adam Howard and Josiah Howard.
We are not related.
You're going to want to hold your applause, so they got a lot of good points tonight. So tonight's program is a conversation between these two cinephiles and Blaxploitation enthusiasts, who despite sharing a last name and a love for Blaxploitation movies are not in fact related. They'll discuss the good and the bad of Blaxploitation films, from the height of the genre's popularity in the 1970s to its contemporary resonance today. This program is being recorded for our virtual audience, and we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the program. So I'm going to take a brief moment to introduce our two speakers, and then I'll hand it over to them. Adam Howard is the curator of You Won't Believe Me, How Blaxploitation Posters Define Pooled and Delivered Profits, on view at Poster House through February 6th. He's also a senior associate producer at the Full Frontal with Samantha Bee show, and co-creator and executive producer of the Full Release with Samantha Bee podcast. He's a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism and studied film history and screenwriting at Bard College. And Josiah Howard is a senior contributor at The Deuce and Fury Cinema, and is the author of Blaxploitation Cinema, the Essential Reference Guide, available in our shop. His writing credits include articles for the American Library of Congress, the New York Times, and Reader's Digest. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to them to take this conversation away.
Thank you.
This works, no? No? Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for that really generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's obviously a lot to brave COVID, so I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be sitting here with Josiah. He did an amazing thing by basically reading through all of my copy to make sure that it was good, and so I appreciate that as well. And I'm excited to be sitting here with you because I am really getting my first opportunity to just ask you how you got into Blaxploitation. What was it that made you so passionate about the genre? Where did you sort of fall in love with Blaxploitation?
So I was a little black boy, if that's not obvious to you. I was in the 70s, very, very young. I saw my first Blaxploitation film at 11, which was too young. The films, most of them are rated R, so they are restricted to people under 17. But don't you know a babysitter who was a teenager, right? She wanted to see the films, and so she brought me and the other child she was babysitting to see Coffee. And it was a shock to my system because so many things I hadn't seen. I had never seen an adult nude. I had never heard the kind of language that was used. We were a middle-class family. I suppose sometimes they curse, but not like that. And of course, I had never seen drug culture. I had never seen intravenous drug use or cocaine use. All of this was a shock to a child. And so Quentin Tarantino once said that, he's the same age as I am, we're both the same age. He said that you could be shocked by the films and turned off and never see them ever again, or you could be addicted to them and love everything about them and their commitment to just entertaining. It's not the cure for cancer, it's not trying to be anything more than it is, but it's an entertainment filled with the things that entertain people: sex, drugs, rock and roll, and young performers that are attractive. So that was my introduction, and I was hooked like Quentin Tarantino. So he did the movies, and I wrote the books, and I just loved them so much. Back at you, Adam. How were you introduced to Blaxploitation?
I can't believe you're the same age as him. Obviously, you're Further proof that black don't crack.
Yes. I wasn't going to say it, but we can say it now, right?
We have to show our love for each other. Yeah, no, I think I'm a little bit younger, if I can be so bold, and I was sort of VHS generation. So I think my older brother, had come from over a friend's house and was sort of bragging about this movie he just saw. He was like, it was crazy. There's this black detective, and he was mouthing off at all the white people, and you would really like it. I was sort of an old soul, I guess, in the sense that I was really into all things 70s for some inexplicable reason. I just really liked the clothes and the music and the whole sort of attitude. And so I'm obviously talking about Shaft. And, I think I saw a censored version of that movie. I'm pretty sure of that because I remember seeing it later and being like, I don't remember that scene. But I just was immediately kind of obsessed with that character, and I sort of wanted to know more about what is this all about. And I didn't realize there was a whole genre, that there was hundreds and hundreds of movies that came after it. I eventually discovered this incredible book called What It Is, What It Was, which came out around the time Jackie Brown was released, which has all of the posters you see on display here and hundreds more, foreign versions, all this sort of stuff. And as a person who was huge into art and now draws posters for fun for my own interests and amusement, I was particularly hooked into that. And I sort of became obsessed with wanting to see these movies behind these incredible posters. To be completely honest, sometimes the movies didn't really live up to the poster. But that being said, I completely concur with you. It was sort of still fun going on this journey. It's kind of this very unique period of time that I love to kind of dip a toe into, and it's rich for me because it's a whole sort of timeline that I unfortunately never got to experience. And speaking of just sort of the relevancy of these movies, I mean, how do you think that they speak to today's generation in any way, if they do at all?
That's a hard one because it can be answered in so many different ways. Obviously, it's a part of hip-hop culture, and certainly the fashion and video representation. Everybody's got their afro or their black look occasionally. That all comes from Blaxploitation. It all comes from the 70s. That's not how people look today, but that's how they dress today occasionally. I think that is one of the lasting points about it. As far as the music, we know that they sample all the black soundtracks and all of the black great artists, Curtis Mayfield and all the other people. So that's there as well. Also, I think the names have traveled. So I talk to a lot of young people at colleges, and they have heard of Shaft. They have heard of Blackula, right? They've heard that. If you hear it once, you remember that. Blackula. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Blackula. So they've heard the names, they know the music, they love the fashion, and that's one of the many reasons why it continues to be present today.
And you have Biggie Smalls took his name from, I believe it's Let's Do It Again as a character in that. Foxy Brown, obviously the movie Foxy Brown. And another reason I was sort of interested in doing this exhibit and pitching it and doing it right now is really for decades, really as long as Hollywood has been a thing, there's been this sort of ongoing conversation and debate around the representation of people of color on film. Really like the first sort of modern blockbuster, Birth of a Nation, is like basically a propaganda film for the KKK. So, going back that far, this conversation has been happening, and in my research, just looking at the backlash to some of these films, the sort of debate over them at the time they were released, it's sort of eerie how much some of those same conversations echo conversations that are happening right now today. The same kind of arguments about, what is the best way to portray black culture, who should be the people, sort of the authorship of the films. Then, not as much now, but then and now you had, white directors, white screenwriters telling, air quotes, black stories. And so that comes with a certain complication of its own. And so to me, this whole genre, this whole period is an important chapter in that ongoing story. It's up to you whether you feel that these films were a step in the wrong direction, but I think they're sort of a fascinating step in one direction or another.
Mm-hmm. So Adam and I did have different opinions about whether or not the images in the films are negative. A lot of the stories are about pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers, and this was a big issue. Is this the way we want to represent ourselves, especially right out of the 60s and the civil rights movement? I do not think they're negative images. I think they're slice of life. There are black pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers. If you only make films about black pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers, there's a problem. But there are blaxploitation films that are not about that. They're family-centered, they're comedies, there are lots of other different genres that are covered. The karate films are not about the kind of exploitation that some of the other films are. So we did have some different opinions about that. What do you want to say?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I think if anything, I'm more speaking to people who may feel that way. I don't know that that's my personal feeling. I think I've just known that people have received these films different types of ways, and I wanted to sort of be receptive to that and open to that. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, there's a lot of things that I've enjoyed over the years that I still enjoy, but if I were to watch them with, you know, 2021 eyes, I could see how they might rub people the wrong way. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what's exciting about this exhibit is that we're putting these films in their proper context, and I think that, you know, this isn't the entirety of black cinema in the 1970s. There's a lot of great films with predominantly black casts that,
Sounder.
Right, that were not necessarily viewed as a part of this genre, and you can debate whether they were or not. Like Blue Collar is one of my favorite movies from the entire decade. It's starring Richard Pryor and Yaphet Kotto, who appear in a lot of what are considered to be blaxploitation movies, but because that's a film written and directed by Paul Schrader, it's viewed as somehow more highbrow. You know, you could make an argument for The Wiz being a blaxploitation film. That's obviously a family-oriented musical. So yeah, I think if anything, I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, not everybody was a fan of these films. Obviously the name itself is derived from a critique that came from the black activist community. It was coined by Junius Griffin, who was the head of the LA NAACP. And a lot of the backlash to these films did come from African Americans, and I just felt like I wanted to acknowledge that, but that's not my personal beef. Like, I'm not really easily rattled or offended by things, and I think, like you, I tend to approach these films as fun, and especially now that we have some time and distance, I think, you know, they should be largely viewed that way. And again, it is exploitation, so it's not meant to be for like the soft-hearted, I would say, you know.
Agreed, and I like that because they are fun. They were cheaply made entertainments that no one ever thought we would be talking about 50 years later. But here we are in New York City at an exhibit. So they lasted, but they were just meant as transitory fun. And so, but they had a lot in them that was reflective of the day, and we're very interested in that, obviously, still.
What did you think? I mean, one of the things that I've been struck by just revisiting these movies and talking about them again is the sort of political subtext in some of these movies. And I was curious, I mean, you've done a lot more deep dives into this than I have, but it pops up in a lot of movies, you know, in Shaft, in Coffee, there's always sort of these black radical characters that are always on the side, but it's very much an acknowledgement that that was something that was happening in the community at the time. I just would love to hear more thoughts on how the movies kind of portrayed those types of characters and in general.
Agreed. So if you were going to make a blaxploitation film, you'd need a certain amount of elements. You'd need the pretty girl, and the sexy guy, and the drug dealer, and the prostitute, the best friend, and you'd also need the black militant, the fist-raising black militant who was advocating for the Black Panther Party. So that's always a character in the films. Some of the films are all about black militancy. How can we get back at Whitey? But most of them just have an incidental character that is the black militant, reflective of the times. The Black Panther Party is the conversation of the time. The Nation of Islam is the conversation of the time. What do we do with these people? They're not doing what Martin Luther King said. They're doing what Malcolm X said. So we have to treat them differently, because they're not about letting you slap me and I'm just going to turn the other cheek. They're about you slap me and I'll blow your head off. So it's a very different, dangerous time reflected in the films by young people. And it's always there. There's always a character that is telling that story, because these are the stories of the young people in the 70s. That's always in the background. There's always a black militant in your college class, or in your high school, or in your neighborhood, or owning the soda shop. That's a part of black life at the time. And so it was always reflected, whether or not you agreed with the party or not.
And do you think, like, I always thought it was sort of curious that in some cases, not always, but in some cases, the hero character kind of stands apart from those groups and is almost somewhat cynical about them. Mm-hmm. And I've always wondered if that was more of a reflection of, in some cases, the white authorship of the movies, in the sense that they don't necessarily, they want to acknowledge, like, this is a thing, but, you know, like Shaft will meet with those guys, he'll work with those guys, but he's very much clearly not a part of that organization.
Perfectly said. So you couldn't have a film about black militancy with white people going to it, right? Or all black people. Not everybody was in agreement with Malcolm X and his ideas. So yes, what you said was, there has to be something for the black radical who is going to see these films, but there has to be something for the white man and the white lady too, and for grandma, and for grandpa. You want to cover all bases. It's a business. You're making a product that you want to sell to the largest audience. So they tried to put it all in there, but you're right. There was always a black character to balance the black anger of the time, and that black character, sometimes older, was not in agreement with the young things. Just be quiet. Just do it as we've been doing it. Yeah. Don't stir anything up. So that's always a part of it too.
Speaking of movies that are perfect for grandma, I would love for you to talk a little bit about Coffee, because I know before this started we agreed that was sort of our mutual favorite of all of these. And so I don't know if you have any sort of specific reflections on that movie. I kind of feel like it has everything you want out of a blaxploitation movie. It kind of hits all the right quadrants, but I would love to get your take on that one.
Well, you just said it perfectly, and I don't have to talk. So it is the best film, in my opinion. In the book, we have 250 films. Coffee is the best one. Why? Because it's everything that every blaxploitation is, but it's told from a woman's perspective. So we had Shaft and Superfly and Slaughter and Sweetback and all of those black heroes who were angry and modern-minded and were going to do what they were going to do. But she's the first woman who is going to do it. So she does everything they do, but from a woman's perspective. And a woman, as we know, works differently through the world. So she's attractive. She will use those other different charms, but she's doing the same thing. And so it's the same story, but it's all these different elements, which is just fascinating. She's not a prostitute. She pretends to be a prostitute to get the drug dealer. She's not a drug addict. She pretends to be. She can do all of these things and has entry to places because nobody thinks a beautiful woman is going to shoot your head off. But she is going to shoot your head off. Nobody thinks a beautiful woman is. Nobody thinks a beautiful woman is going to run you over with a car. She's going to run you over with a car. Nobody thinks a beautiful woman is going to put razor blades in her hair because she knows she's going to get in a fight. She's going to put razor blades in her hair because she is going to get hers. She's going to get hers the way that she knows. She's from the ghetto, and she talks about that a lot in the film. So that's one of the major reasons I love it the most, because it's Shaft and Superfly and Sweetback from a woman's perspective, which is, to me, just so much more interesting.
Yeah.
It's so much more interesting.
And it's got a great soundtrack, too.
Yes, Roy Ayers, yeah. You love it, so why do you love it so much?
Well, I mean, I think Pam Grier sort of seems to be the one star from this era that rose above the genre by most people's standards. I think even people who maybe haven't seen these films, they've heard of Pam Grier, and I think she had such incredible star power. I think she was a phenomenal actress, and I think it's a really great performance. I mean, she does a kind of wacky accent in it that's not the best, but for the most part, it's a really great performance, and it's a very real character that she's playing, which I think in a lot of these other movies, as fun as they are, they're exaggerated. They're basically cartoons, or they're sort of, action heroes, so they're not allowed to have a lot of emotional layers. She has multiple layers in this movie. And yeah, I think it's just one of the most cohesive and accessible as far as storytelling. like you said, the music, the costumes, it sort of has everything I would have wanted out of this type of movie. That being said, different films have meant something to me at different times. I mean, Shaft was sort of my introduction to all of this. Superfly was definitely, one of the more like early sort of graphic, dirty movies that I saw as a kid. It was like pretty shocking for me as like a young person. So I'll always have a nostalgic attachment to it for that. Black Caesar is a movie that I was aware of because Public Enemy referenced it in a song. So like, when it comes to soundtracks or the movies themselves or even the posters themselves, my affinity sort of changes depending on like wherever my head is at any given time. But yeah, I think that like she has something about her that, it's actually mentioned in this profile that's in the display case here from Ms. Magazine, that she was basically clearly could have been, should have been a much bigger movie star, sort of crossing over, but she wasn't given the opportunity. And, Jackie Brown kind of showed years later what she was capable of. And I think it's still criminal how underutilized she's been by Hollywood. But yeah, that's my rant.
Adam also wrote something about many of the films having a downbeat ending, so they don't all end up happily ever after. We don't always get Whitey. Sometimes the film ends and Whitey got us. Coffee is a film that has a downbeat ending. It's not, things don't work out as you might think they would. So those are powerful films. They're not typical, right? Most of the films are popular because they're designed for hoots and hollers and fun and ending up with the black man on top and the white man subjugated for a change. But Coffee is, I think, powerful. That's another reason, because it ends on a note where you're just kind of left dazed after seeing 90 minutes of violence.
Yeah, I also really like the ending of Black Caesar. I'm spoiling it now, which is neither here nor there, but like like a lot of these films, it involves a white villain getting his comeuppance, but it's the way in which it happens. And basically this white character who's been antagonizing the hero throughout the movie is forced to put on blackface and then is beaten to death with a shoe shine box. It's like a very like shocking, jarring ending. And that film was made by Larry Cohen, who, if you're familiar with him, he was one of sort of the great guerrilla B-movie directors. He sort of was infamous for doing a lot of sort of stolen shots and things like that. So there's a scene in that movie where Fred Williamson is shot and he's roaming the streets of New York City, and it's very transparent that that was just sort of shot for real. Like there's people reacting to him like, oh my God, there's a guy who's been shot. And it gives it kind of a vitality and authenticity that you just don't get out of a lot of movies, even movies of that period. And a Detroit 9000 is another one like that has kind of like a gut punch of an ending. That's sort of a 70s era trope in the first place. It's why it's my favorite era of movies, period, is that even your most popular, Hollywood movies can have these sort of downbeat or ambiguous endings. Like I wouldn't call the ending of The Godfather happy per se. I wouldn't call the ending of The Exorcist happy. But there's a reason why those movies stand the test of time. And I think that to me is what makes a movie great, is if you can still find something interesting to say about it, 30, 40, 50 years later. And that wouldn't be the case of like The Thing with Two Heads, I would say, but at least half of these, I would say there's something to chew on even now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's a question that you and I had a question about. What role do you think the white gaze has played in the reception of Blaxploitation films?
Well, I think it's, curious that, you brought up Tarantino, and it's kind of hard not to on a question like that. I actually really like his movies, so, maybe that's an unpopular opinion, I don't know. But clearly he's somebody who grew up watching these movies, had a very genuine affinity for them, and in his own way has, tried to pay tribute to them. Before you nice people came in, we were talking about this because I struggle with the idea that it's my role to police what other people like. It's sort of, that seems absurd to me. I feel like people should be allowed to like whatever they want to like. It's kind of how you show your appreciation is where I think things can get a little bit dicey. Every Halloween, somebody decides to wear, a blackface costume to a Halloween party, and they say they're paying tribute to some movie or singer that they love, and it's sort of like, I feel like we should have learned that lesson, but we're going to learn it again, and we'll probably learn it again this year. But yeah, I think that, there's a challenge when it comes to movies that center on Black people, because there is a certain audience that sees that and takes that as gospel and says, okay, that is the Black experience. And there's so many movies about white people that you don't necessarily have that problem. It's not like you're going to go see, and I hate to keep using the example of The Godfather, but go see The Godfather and say, oh, okay, this is what white people's experience is. It's like you're able to see it as an individual thing, whereas especially at that time there wasn't a ton of offerings. There were some, but I think that's I think where there are problems that come in sort of in sense of people just kind of saying, okay, like a lot of these movies are about crime, so this must be a community that's just kind of steeped in crime and that's their experience, and it's sort of an inability to see that it is some people's experience. It is a part of the Black experience, and I guess we'll just have to keep making movies showing other aspects of our lives for people to get that. But yeah, I think we were saying like jazz and the blues are art forms that Black people created and were embraced by the African American community, and then for whatever reason they don't seem to be as much. If you go to a jazz concert now or a blues concert now, odds are the audience is going to be predominantly white. I don't have an answer for why that is. I think there's a camp value to these movies, and if you like camp and regardless of what race you have, I think you can see the appeal of them. So yeah, that's my answer on that one.
So, how did you choose out of 250 films,
right,
the 20 posters that are on display here?
It's a good question. It's a tough thing to do. I think I was glad I was limited by the space, so I had sort of a certain number that I could pick, so that was helpful. And then as far as the genre is concerned, there are certain touchstones, there are certain films that you sort of can't not have. So, I had to represent Pam Grier, I had to represent Fred Williamson, Superfly needed to be there, Shaft needed to be there, Sweetback. And then to some extent it became just posters that I really liked. And always had been kind of drawn to from an artistic perspective. And then finally, I tried to find a way to fit my personal likes and the sort of historic milestones into the framework of some kind of a story that I could tell. And it was helpful for me that Blaxploitation, from most people's general perspective, is like an era that had a beginning, middle, and end, more or less. I mean, people can argue if films that came out in the 80s and 90s were sort of, leftover Blaxploitation movies, but for the most part, it was a 70s phenomenon, so that helped me. And so, yeah, I basically wanted to tell the story of how this period came to be, how it evolved, and then how it ended. And at the same time, kind of indulge my own personal affinity for the artwork. So for instance, The Black Gestapo is a completely unwatchable movie in my opinion, but I love the poster. It's probably one of my favorite ones from a graphics artwork perspective. It promises a movie that it can't really deliver, but that's what I love about it. It's like, it's so striking, and it's like coming right at you, which I also kind of like.
Also one of the most controversial ones because
Yeah.
it does use concentration camp footage in the beginning. They are training African Americans to take care of themselves, and it's been written about a lot that footage seems completely out of place.
Right.
Just really wrong choice.
Yeah, as with all the exploitation genres, there's little offshoots, right? There's the sexploitation movies of the period, then there's like the Nazi sexploitation movies of the period, which is like a whole thing. I guess they parodied that in Grindhouse with the werewolf woman of the SS. That's another thing, I'm glad you brought that up actually, because that's another thing I wanted to represent, is that even though for the most part, the films that people know best from the Blaxploitation genre are the crime films, there's the horror movies, there's comedies like Let's Do It Again, there's, science fiction, there's, sort of melodrama like Potboiler, Mandingo is kind of like a soap opera kind of thing, Dolomite is in a category in and of itself, I would say. So yeah, I think like I wanted to kind of give people a sense that this was more than just shoot 'em ups. It was a lot more thoughtful than that. So yeah. I hope that answers that question.
I like that you touched on the Black Gestapo because that's a kind of off the radar one,
Sure.
as so many of the films are. What do you think about all of the low budget independent films? Lower budget than these. By the way, most of the films were made for $500,000. And then if they could bring in more than that, then they were profitable. And that's why they kept being made, because they could bring in more than that. They were appealing to a very hungry African-American audience. We didn't talk about it yet, but in 1970, when the first film comes up, which is Cotton Comes to Harlem, a comedy, multicast comedy, it is proven to Hollywood that, black films can make money. They can make money if it's a black cast. Usually Hollywood's idea was, well, you put a black person in a film, but it's really a white film with a black person in it. This was all black cast, new actors. It wasn't Sidney Poitier, bless his heart, who was the star of the previous 10 years in the 1960s, Oscar winner. These were all new, young black faces that were not doctors and lawyers and professors. These were young people who worked at the car wash, or who worked at the hospital, or who were janitors. So it seemed more modern, not only because we weren't afraid to show black people in the real roles that we play in life, which is sometimes just the waiter, but because it was young, new faces that we hadn't seen before, who looked like young people at the time, with afros, with modern bell-bottoms. And who were sexy, right? There's a debate about Sidney Poitier, and a famous article in the New York Times. He's a wonderful talent and a phenomenal actor, but he was never allowed to be or thought to be a sexy man. So then you have all of these men that come along, and there's no doubt they're sexy. There's no doubt they're sexy at all. Many of them come from the sports fields. Fred Williamson was a football star, as was Jim Brown. So they're sexy, there's no doubt about it. And there's no doubt that Pam Grier is sexy. And that's a different thing, that they're young and black and sexy, not just the nurse or the lawyer.
Ray Milland. Sexy guy.
Yeah. So it's a fun time when we get to be sexy too, for the first time in films.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy in retrospect because Sidney Poitier is also like a gorgeous person. So it's sort of surreal that he was like so aggressively desexualized.
Yes.
But yeah, that's another reason I love this era is, you can actually, God forbid, show black people with some skin, and it's like not frightening to anybody, and it's who knew it would actually be super appealing. But yeah, I think that if you look at a poster from even as recently as 67, 68, 69, I mean, it's almost as if with Poitier in particular, he's always in like a suit, and like every inch of him is covered. It's like, let's not even think about it. This guy may or may not have arms, who's to say? And I love where if you're watching a Jim Brown movie, he will be shirtless at some point.
Always.
That will
So
occur.
Fred Williamson. And the young women, they'll be topless. I've interviewed a few of the actresses and a few of the directors. I said to Jack Hill, who did Coffee, he wrote it and directed it. I asked, when you asked the female performers to perform without a top on, right? Were they uncomfortable? Because that's a political correct question for 2021. You're asking actors to be nude. And he said they loved it. Because Pam Grier said, I'll never look better, let's get it on film. So I love that. So you ask the actor if they're willing to do that. And yes, that looked good.
Right.
So I was relaxed after hearing that, because you wonder if people are being exploited for the nudity. No, I'm young and I'm fine with it. Let's do it.
And after decades and decades of not even being allowed to kiss on screen, I feel like I'm sure on some level it is liberating. I mean, these movies also certainly push boundaries as far as the taboo of showing interracial relationships.
Yeah, big one.
Speaking of Sidney Poitier, if you've ever seen Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, I think they kiss once and they show it in the rear view mirror of a taxi cab for like a couple of seconds. And I believe that they would even cut that shot out when the movie was shown in the South. And then, you flash forward, I want to say I'm terrible at math, but 5 years later to Slaughter, and it's like very graphic, very long sex scene with Jim Brown and Stella Stevens. And so, it's pretty wild in terms of, part of it is the Hollywood kind of censorship breaking down a little bit, and movies in general were becoming more explicit and a little bit more, overtly violent and things of that nature. But, I don't think we can discount how revolutionary it was to see Black people doing these things. And, Sweetsback, I guess, in a way kind of set the blueprint for that, because that movie was financed as a sex movie, and it is, has unsimulated sex in it. It's like very overtly, the name is a sexual thing. It's like, you can't avoid it. It's a big part of this genre.
Have people seen Sweetback? Have we seen that one? Yeah. That is a film that I'm dubious about.
Yeah.
Unlike yourself. I have some questions about it. There is an underage young boy who is simulating sex with a nude grown woman, and they're both nude on a bed. And so these are things, just moments in the film that take me out of it. And I believe it's his son Melvin.
Yeah, that's his son,
Yeah. So everyone was in agreement, but it's not, I come away from it uncomfortable with that decision. Just one scene, but it's one of the things that is disturbing to me. Is it to you? Because a lot of people...
Yeah, I would say, I wouldn't say like I wholeheartedly endorse that movie. I think, to me, that's a movie I would sort of say, I think this is a better film, but I kind of think about it the same way I think about a movie like Easy Rider, where to me it's more about what the movie represented than the content itself. I think Easy Rider is a stronger film, but in many ways, to me, the power of Sweetback is just what it represented, not so much as a film in and of itself. And part of why I named this exhibit after a phrase that appears repeatedly in that film, sort of like a mantra. He says, "You bled my mama, you bled my papa, but you won't bleed me," is that, to me, the thing that unites a lot of these movies is a sort of a defiant attitude and a sort of a sense that what has come before is not going to happen this time. I think you touched on this a little bit in some of the things you were talking about before. This kind of idea of the man or a white sort of figure of power or authority sort of traditionally winning at the end of movies, or certainly appearing higher status than a Black character in a movie. And that just sort of is not happening in these movies. And I think that's why I think that movie, Sweetback, sort of landed and had such an impact at the time. I think if you watch it now, there's amateurish things in it. It doesn't have sort of a very like cohesive narrative that you can really sink your teeth into. It's a pretty simple premise, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff in it that is upsetting, to be sure.
Maybe that's the reason.
But yeah, I think I think it's fair. I don't know. Maybe he would disagree, but I think that Melvin Peoples made that movie to be an act of provocation. I think that's what it was, and I think it achieves that even now. I think even now there's things in that movie that will sort of floor you a little bit. But then there are things that, yeah, I totally agree with you that kind of rub me the wrong way as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We haven't talked about the soundtracks. We know that music is such a big part of the films. Every Black recording store at the time made a soundtrack album. So Marvin Gaye, Barry White, Gladys Knight, Curtis Mayfield, obviously Isaac Hayes. If you were Black and young and you were a music performer, you made a Blaxploitation soundtrack. My favorite soundtrack, and of course each film has one, so there's more than 200, is by Marvin Gaye, who we know from What's Going On. The year before, 71, he has the hit What's Going On. 72, he does a soundtrack to a film called Trouble Man. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. There's this theme song, Trouble Man, and then of course there's lots of ambient music with his beautiful falsetto voice. Of course, many people don't know he played the piano and drums. He was a musician, not just a singer. A wonderful soundtrack album by Marvin Gaye, whose name we already know. That's my favorite one. Favorite soundtrack?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say on that one too, that came out, if you're a Marvin Gaye fan, right after What's Going On and right before Let's Get It On. So it's sort of like
Sounded like songs.
It's a trilogy in a way, but it's like this was sort of his like masterpiece period where he could sort of do no wrong, and so but it's the one that gets overlooked and probably because it's associated with a movie, but it is really kind of a standalone album in its own right. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you can appreciate the music. I mean, I think Shaft, the soundtrack to Shaft was an introduction for me to all of this. And my father had it on vinyl. I'm a big vinyl nerd. I have way too many. I literally have an arrangement with my wife where I'm not allowed to bring anything new into the house without removing one. So I have a lot of these, but I've had to like beg off of a few. But certainly,
when you Zoom with Adam, he has them all on his wall behind him.
That's true. But yeah, so that one, and what was cool about that record and why one of the reasons I love vinyl is it had all these pictures from the movie in it. It had like the plot summary. So before I even saw the movie, I sort of saw the movie. But now like I've been kind of listening to Foxy Brown a lot more. I was saying to Josiah before the event that I love the singer Willie Hutch. He did the score for that. He did a lot of the songs from the Mac. He has this really beautiful ballad called I Choose You, which is one of my favorite songs, just period. Now, if you think about the song too deeply, he's like talking about a pimp and he's like singing to a prostitute, so maybe that kind of takes the romance out of it to some degree, but I just love that song. So I guess that's the one I've been listening to a bunch, but I think as you were coming in, Superfly was playing, and I think that's another one that is sort of a huge touchstone just in music, regardless of the movie. But what's cool about that soundtrack is it's sort of a commentary on the movie to some extent. So that film, as you may know, was sort of vilified in some quarters at the time it came out as glorifying drug dealing. I think if you see the movie now, I don't really know why somebody would have that takeaway, because it doesn't look like a lifestyle that I would particularly want to engage in. But either way, the soundtrack certainly portrays a lot more ambiguity about what it would mean to be involved in the drug trade and all that sort of stuff. So if you haven't heard it, I'd say that and Shaft are kind of the two sort of legendary soundtracks. But really almost all of these movies have amazing music in it, and what's cool if you're a hip hop fan is you'll hear certain phrases or beats or even sampled dialogue and be like, oh, that came from that. Like there's a whole like bathtub scene in Superfly that's like the opening of the Snoop Doggy Dogg Doggy Style album, and it's basically like he's recreating the movie and you're just listening to it. So yeah.
Yeah, soundtracks were often considered a third star in the film. So when the projects were put together, it was the actors and the script and the story and who's doing the music. So it was very, very important because you had the movie, but then you had the music stars. So lots of different reasons to go to the movie. If you like Gladys Knight, well, she's singing the soundtrack to it. And so are the others. So it's a very important element always talked about. Did we speak about how the film saved saved Hollywood?
No. I mean, that's a huge part of. I mean, it's part of where the title comes from as well. It may seem odd now in retrospect, but there was a period where Hollywood profits were kind of on a low ebb in the late 60s leading into the early 70s. There were plenty of hit movies, but just not enough to kind of keep a lot of the film studios in the black. And when Sweetback kind of came along, and to some extent When It Comes to Harlem, they proved profitable and they were inexpensive and they kind of made a quick profit with black audiences who to this day disproportionately go to the movies. It's just sort of one of these things. And I guess because it's always been a more affordable form of entertainment, so black people have gone to the movies. And so I think the studios kind of recognize that there's something there. And by 73, you had something like 150 of these movies going into production, just like an unbelievable amount of content. So there's a lot of movies that are totally lost and forgotten now. These are kind of more like well-known-ish examples of the genre, but it was really kind of a huge fad, and then it sort of died off. I guess one could argue around the time that Jaws was released. I think that was sort of the modern day iteration of the blockbuster.
75,
Yeah, the saturation release, that idea of a movie that will suddenly be in 1,000 theaters first weekend, that wasn't the case. It was like a lot of these movies, they played in urban centers and then eventually made their way to your town, kind of a thing. And then, you know, Star Wars was probably the next kind of kick in the gut of this genre, you know, for better or worse. And so, yeah, I think by the time you get into the 80s, I think the studios again came around to recognizing, oh, well, black audiences will also go to these big blockbuster movies too, and so why don't we just get everybody, essentially. That's probably the most generous read on it. But this has been repeated a lot in popular culture. If you remember, when the WB and UPN were first launched, almost all of their programming was skewing to black audiences. And then once they became profitable, they became the CW, and suddenly it was Gossip Girl and all this sort of stuff. And Fox, you know, when Fox first came on the air, they had In Living Color, and they had a lot of like black-oriented shows. So this is something that the industry has learned to do when they're kind of struggling. And it's, you know, it's just history, I guess.
I like what you said. I do differ with the idea, and it's controversial because I speak about the films a lot, that Blaxploitation films saved Hollywood. So Hollywood doesn't need saving. It never has, and it never will. Hollywood was having some financial troubles. Black films came along and helped them along, but Hollywood would have been fine without the films. What Hollywood did was embrace them for a period. I mean, Richard Roundtree was on the cover of Newsweek. Pam Grier is on the cover of Ms. Magazine. So they were visible, they were everywhere all at once, so they had a phenomenal impact. But the films didn't save Hollywood. They were things that made money for a short time. And one of the many arguments, you may join me, is that they stopped being popular was because that black image of the modern young man and woman was showing up in TV shows. Good Times, Jeffersons, That's My Mama. You were seeing those same kind of things on TV, so you didn't have to go to the movies anymore. It wasn't such a thrilling thing to see. You could see someone who looked like you, which was the thrill for me, on your television each week for free. So one of the many reasons that things changed, I don't have to go to the movies. Let's just watch Good Times or whatever else is on, all of the TV movies and stuff. But what do you say about that? Do you want to stay with Blaxploitation films saved Hollywood?
Well, I don't remember saying that specifically.
But is that where you're coming from, in the back of your head?
No. I mean, I think, look, I mean, anything like this, you know, it's sort of like, this is a weird comparison, but bear with me. It's sort of like when people talk about, like, how did Donald Trump get elected, and they say it was because of this, and it's like, well, it's a confluence of things. There's many different reasons why this thing happened that shocked people. Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes to the birth of Blaxploitation and the so-called death of Blaxploitation, there's, you know, many factors that played into it. I hadn't even thought about the television factor, which is totally legitimate. I think it's too easy. I mean, this story has been told not just about Blaxploitation, but also about sort of auteur-driven, you know, highbrow cinema of the 70s. Like, it got killed because of Jaws. It's like, well, you know, there was like The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now. Like, these movies all came out after Jaws, and I don't think of those as sort of popcorn movies. So I think it's many different factors. I think that certainly there was an advent of a certain kind of blockbuster filmmaking that, you know, didn't, for whatever reason, prioritize diversity. I think there was the critical backlash and the sort of very vocal activist community, you know, black activists who took issue with these movies. There's the oft-told argument that because The Wiz underperformed at the box office, that kind of scared Hollywood off of making predominantly black films. Who's to say, you know, it probably played a role. I think a lot of these things played a role. So I also think to some extent it may have been too much of a good thing. I mean, I think when you have hundreds and hundreds of these movies, you know, you might have had a bit of an oversaturation thing happening. So I think it's all of these things are a piece, and it may have been just something that was too kind of its time to survive. But, you know, I'm glad that some of these movies have sort of held on. I'm glad, I mean, to make a totally awkward, self-serving transition, I'm glad that the posters have survived as sort of a tribute to this period, and I think, you know, if this in any way can serve as a gateway to rediscovering some of these movies, then I'll be more than happy with that.
That's what I think too, with my writing. What is something you'd like to tell our audience about the films that you have not discussed and that they may not know?
Wow. I don't know. I don't know. What they may not know. Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of anything. I think we've covered quite a bit. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, I just think, I think I would recommend checking some of them out if you can find them, and I would just say, you know, when you
Coffee, please.
Yeah.
Has everybody seen Coffee? Yeah, Coffee
Yeah.
is where you start if you haven't seen any.
And I would just, and I would view all of them with the context in which they came out and all of that sort of stuff. I love older movies. This is predominantly what I watch for fun, so I don't feel like I have to kind of give those caveats for myself, but for others, maybe it might be a little bit of a strange new journey to a new place, but it might be fun. You might want to hang out there for a while. And yeah, I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys if you have any questions for us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm sorry, could you talk a little bit more about Sweet Sweetback? Because aesthetically the poster is so different and
Right.
it's set apart.
Do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so the question was, could I speak more to the significance of Sweet Sweetback and sort of how that poster is sort of different than the others? That movie was very much kind of an experiment in kind of guerrilla filmmaking. Everything about that movie was sort of hustling on Melvin Van Peebles' part, who wrote, directed, and starred in it. You know, he raised money from all different sorts of sources. Actually, Bill Cosby was a big donator to that movie. My understanding is that he sort of sold it to financiers as a pornographic film in order to help get it made. He had been in the Hollywood system to some extent. He had made a film called Watermelon Man that had done okay, but basically he had become sort of disenchanted with what Hollywood had to offer him, and so he went off and made this movie on his own. And I think the poster kind of, in some ways, communicates that aesthetic. If you'll see on the poster, it says rated X by an all-white jury, so it's really kind of leaning into the idea that this is sort of the movie that your white neighbors don't want you to see. And when it came out, you know, it not only did it commercially perform better than I think anyone was sort of expecting, it was embraced by some quarters of the Black radical movement. The Black Panthers sort of, you know, gave it their seal of approval sort of tentatively. And so it became something of like a happening. It would be kind of like the movie you go see because it's sort of, people are talking about it, and it's supposed to be this righteous movie. I think there's like a Stevie Wonder song that literally talks about how like, we're gonna go see Sweet Sweetback or whatever. So I think, yeah, that and what's interesting is that Melvin Van Peebles himself has never really been super comfortable being associated as being a part of this whole genre or being, you know, credited as the person who created it, but I felt I had to include it because just in that sort of general sense of people's knowledge of these movies, it's the one that people feel kind of started it all, even though it came out a year after Cotton Comes to Harlem. And I think it's fair to say that the commercial success of that movie helped get the studios kind of interested in financing more of them, so.
As many films as there were very few that went to #1 on Variety's box office list, meaning that white people and black people together are seeing it. That was the first. Sweetback is the first Blaxploitation film to go to #1. I think there are only 7 that go to #1. It'll still be popular at #2 and #5, but only 7 went to #1, and Sweetback was the very first. Any other questions? Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a Native person, and the big film for me was Billy Jack. It's probably the only film, right, for Native people. And I saw it when I was like 13. And, it's cringeworthy now. It's a really bad film, but it was so empowering when I was 13. And you know, I just remember it, I just felt like, I felt so connected to it because it was like, you know, this native guy kicking butt, you know?
Yeah.
And I just wondered, it was very empowering to me at that time, and you being a young person seeing these films, did you have that same feeling that it was empowering to see these films, or I mean, aside from the entertainment part?
Well, great question. And I too saw Billy Jack at the same time and was just as thrilled as I was seeing the Blaxploitation films. It was kind of the working class man gets his day in the sun. And so I love Billy Jack. You could call it whitesploitation, right? Because it has all the things that Blaxploitation has, but the characters are just white. It has the action, it has the sex, it has the violence, of course, and the car chases. So it's all there. I love that film. And I can imagine it being very inspirational to a native like yourself, even as these films were to us.
This is super random, but when I was in high school, we did, in a film class, don't ask me why, we watched that movie, and a bunch of my classmates and I did a Blaxploitation sort of parody version of it that we called Billy Black. This probably exists somewhere. I've not seen it in years, but it was basically us just recreating the movie, but in our minds making it blacker. But yeah, I think like there's a lot of crossover with like a certain kind of butt kicking aesthetic, right? It's like, you know, black folks love Bruce Lee movies, you know, kung fu movies in general, but, you know, there's something about that character, regardless of race, that, to your point, somebody who's sort of, I mean, this is like a cliche phrase, but sticking it to the man, I mean, I can't think of a better one. And the man can be any number of things. I mean, it's usually a white person, but it's really just an authority figure who's kind of making your life more difficult. And I think there's something, even now, you know, if you see a movie where there's that power dynamic, there's always something cathartic about seeing the righteous person win. I think it's something that movies are uniquely able to do in just a very visceral, emotional way. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, sir.
So I saw a lot of like the parody films first.
Like Dolomite, or you mean the remakes?
I mean, like I'm Gonna Get You Sucker, or
Yes.
Hollywood Shuffle, or like Black Dynamite.
Yes.
And I'm like, do you feel like those films like robbed? Like then I saw these films afterwards, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, like are these cheap shots, or are these like homages, or are they like, you know what I'm saying? Like I don't know, how do you place them in like the context of like these films? Is it just more fun?
I've always thought of them as affectionate. I mean, that's how I read them to be. I think, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know a ton about, you know, the making of them. And of course, there's things to make fun of. Like in the best movie, there's things to nitpick or to tease, or especially like if a movie becomes iconic, it's like with enough time that passes. Like how many times has The Simpsons parodied, you know, Citizen Kane? But it's like, it becomes a part of the lexicon, and I think to some degree, even if you haven't seen, like people understand the Pam Grier type or the Jim Brown type, and so there is something kind of humorous about it if you want to take it in that direction. But I've always looked at those movies as very sweet-natured, and kind of, they're poking fun at it, but it's also like, they clearly think it's cool, and it's part of why like Jim Brown is in I'm Gonna Get You Suckin', and Isaac Hayes is I mean, it's sort of a nod to those guys being awesome. And like, I love that bit about, you know, every hero has to have their own like theme music, and he's got like the band walking behind him or whatever. Like, you know, that's fun. I don't think of any of that as like a negative personally, but.
Agreed. I like the word affectionate. I think they're in respect to them, and I think the largest value is that they continue bringing the Blaxploitation idea and format to the new audiences, to the new generations. So you may start off with I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. Hopefully you'll go back to Coffee, 1973. Yes.
I have a couple of questions, but one thing is if anybody wants to check out some stuff, you might want to check the YouTube channel Real Black, R-E-E-L, Black.
Love that channel, very good.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on some of the horror of that era, like let's say Abby being kind of the black version of The Exorcist. And also one other question, Were there any Blaxploitation movies that were just so bad even black people were like, yeah, this is because I remember years back hearing about the movie Darktown Strutters, and the poster's awesome.
Beautiful.
3 women on quads and stuff,
Yeah.
and then I saw it, and it was just trash. So I'm just curious if there was any movies like that.
Well, I will let you take that one because you know more of these movies than I do, but I know that the collector, his name's Mathieu Beton, who donated all these amazing posters, he was mentioning just at the opening that Blackenstein is one of the worst movies of all time. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I mean, again, to your point, like if you look up that poster, it looks so fun. And that's why I guess I always am like caveat, like, yeah, Coffee is a great movie, Thing with Two Heads, depending on your mood, it might be a good movie, you might want to be a little inebriated, who's to say? But like, yeah, I think like that's one that comes to mind. And the first part of your question, remind me again, because I wanted to answer that too.
About horror movies?
Oh yeah, one of the great ones, and I was torn because I just didn't love the poster art for it, but I thought it was like one of the best movies of the genre is this movie called Ganja and Hess. I don't know if you would have seen it, but that is this amazing, film that when it first came out was kind of it was like appreciated in film festivals and some critics got it, but it didn't have the commercial success that say Blackula did, but it's this amazing, super interesting movie with a lot of social commentary, and Spike Lee essentially remade it almost shot for shot in this movie called The Sweet Blood of Jesus. So that's a really cool one to check out. There's another kind of a zombie one that's interesting called Sugar Hill. Again, I had to kind of pick and choose, and I felt like Blackula is just such a huge touchstone movie that I couldn't not include it. And I also just love the art for JD's Revenge, and I also think that's like a very fun movie. But yeah, I think like now it's getting, for whatever reason, I guess because of the success of Get Out and now Candyman, there's this sort of, now it's become very like hip to talk about like, oh, like black horror, and I guess there was a documentary like Horror Noir that came out like a couple years ago. But it's been a thing. I mean, literally this morning I was just for shits and giggles watching Death by Temptation because it was on Amazon Prime. Like, they're just, I don't know if it's just because some of our real world experience can be horrific, and so we're kind of, there's some weird catharsis out of watching a horror film. I'm no psychologist, I can't say, but I love horror movies, and I do think they're like a really important part of this whole genre aesthetic, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so I love the horror movies too. A lot of the films were made for $500,000, but a lot were made for $250,000. And so a lot of the horror films are the lowest budgeted ones, like Abby that you mentioned, and Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde.
I forgot that one, yeah. And a really cool poster. It's a really cool poster too. Yeah.
So they're really, really low budget. Means one take. If there may be flub lines in it, or the lighting may be bad, but there's no more money to redo it. So that's in the film too. I love them all. The best I would say is Dr. Black, Mr. Hyde, not because it's good, because it's bad. And just an insane title. He becomes a creature, but before he does, he's African American. He turns into an albino. So he's a black man with white. He's painted white. So that's a fun one. You mentioned Dark Strutters, which I wanted to say was among the many films that are just bad. So there's 250. We can say it. Maybe 100 are good. It doesn't mean the other 150 aren't interesting, aren't worthy of seeing, aren't culturally important, but they're bad because there's just no money, because some of the actors are not actors, they're models pulled in. So a lot of them aren't good. You have to go to the films understanding that it may not be good, but appreciating what is there. Maybe just like the clothes or the music. Music is almost always good, right? But a lot of them are not very good in the way that you expect them to be. It's just because there's just no money to make them good. There's no money to improve. Films aren't made with one take for each scene. They're made with 30 takes for each scene, but that costs money. So I love the low budget films. Most are lower than 500,000, which means they're the way they appear is low budget. And Darktown Strutters is one of those. Great title, Darktown Strutters, controversial. We did not get into the N-word in movie titles. Not in the movies. Of course, they're saying it all the time in the movies. But there are 5 films that showed up on marquees with the N-word in them. And that was something that was acceptable in the 1970s, if you could believe it or not. The Legend of N. Charlie was the first, so popular that it has a sequel, The Soul of N. Charlie, on marquees. And there are a few other films. So that passed the censors, it made it into the film theaters, and it made it up on the marquee. The N-word is a part of the story of these films.
I was just wondering, when you were looking at all of the art, and like, was there any specific poster artists or designers that came up very often? And do you think there was a reason for like the style that's so predominant in this room being used so recurrently?
Yes, so there were a couple of artists that came up a couple of times, not sort of universally, but there's an artist, George Akamoto, who did a couple of these. Tom Jung, I believe, did a couple. I think Richard or Robert Tannenbaum, the name is escaping me. These are, kind of, they were doing all sorts of films at that time. I mean, these were studio hired artists, so they actually, in some cases, they're employing kind of what was the style at the time for just this type of movie. Some are more distinct than others, but this kind of aesthetic, like the Slaughter one, which is kind of, I guess, become my favorite in recent, or just, it changes from time to time, but I love that he's wearing like a tuxedo, but then shooting a shotgun is just my favorite kind of like Blaxploitation statement kind of thing. But if you can see, like, it has so many like scenes from the movie playing out in the poster, and there's this Fred Williamson quote that's on, I think, the column out there, that's, the movie had the poster to tell the story, basically, to grab people's attention. This is before blanket advertising, there's no internet, there's no, huge advertising campaign to like raise awareness. Maybe some interviews, but probably in mostly black media, they're not going on the Today Show to, promote Blackula. So you're basically talking about, somebody passing by your movie theater and what's going to grab their attention, what's going to make them kind of linger and say, wait a minute, like Pam Grier is going to make you stop for a minute and say, what is this? And there's a lot of like great text on the posters. There's a lot of like funny things, like just white bigot's head on a soul brother's body. Like, I have to read the rest of that. Like, what is that about? And it's sort of, in some ways, it's kind of like, it's very much telling you like, this is what this is, either in the title or like, I'm shooting a shotgun at you. But then there's like clever stuff too. This movie, Black Caesar, is really an homage to the classic Edward G. Robinson movie, Little Caesar. And there's like nods to that too. So yeah, I think like the style tends to be like, we're going to emphasize sex, we're going to emphasize violence. If we have like a star, or we're somebody we're establishing as a star, we're going to put them front and center and not really downplay them in any way, which is definitely a break from the Sidney Poitier model. But other than that, it's really like there's all different styles here and all different kinds of artist approaches that are represented. I mean, Mandingo is very different than, Black Mama, White Mama. It's just all kind of, to me, that's what's kind of great about it, is it's not any one thing. That's why the genre is kind of a cool one to look back on. But I hope that answers that one. Sorry, you had a question.
Well, it's perfect. It was kind of the same question, but to piggyback off that, it's come up a few times that the poster promises something that the movie can't deliver.
Right.
And to understand that they're going through a studio designer, it's just getting assigned to them.
Yeah, or in some cases, I can't speak to a specific one, but in some cases, posters were conceived and sold, like you're selling the movie off of the poster. And that's not just a black thing. I mean, that happened all the time. Like, somebody would be trying to raise financing for a movie and they'd say like, these are the stars and this is what we think will happen in the movie. And then people would give money and then you try to make that happen in the movie. But yeah, I mean, the one that the best example of that is Blackula, where there's like a scene depicted on the poster where he's attacking a white woman that, the best of my memory, does not happen in the movie. And some of the advertising kind of tried to lean into the implication of interracial stuff going on to kind of get people jazzed about the movie maybe being a little bit more irreverent than it was in that regard. And yeah, it's sort of like if you see like old James Bond posters, that comes up too, where there'll be something in there. Sort of like when you see a trailer and there's something depicted in the trailer, and when you see the movie, you're like, oh yeah, that part didn't happen. I think, you know, these posters are just sort of capturing the spirit of the thing. Like, I've seen Slaughter many times. I don't remember Jim Brown like picking up that guy quite that way, but like, who cares? You know, it's like, and to your point about the budget thing, it's like, you can't not see the seams in some of these movies, but I've always felt like the budget stuff, like sure, if a movie is hundreds of millions of dollars, you expect that to be reflected on the screen in some way, but if I'm enjoying a movie, I usually am not affected by budget stuff. Like if it's good,
pass, yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, like Get Out only costs $3 million. If you see that movie, you never like, oh, this is like a cheap movie. Now, if you work, I work in TV production, so I could like sit there and be like, oh, I can see where they cut corners there, or why this was able to, you know, they did this to cheat or whatever. But when you're watching that movie, hopefully you're not thinking about that kind of thing because the movie's good. And I think, yeah, with the movies where you maybe notice that stuff more, it's because the movie isn't really working for you, and so you're like, oh, that boom mic has been hanging out a little too long.
Yes.
Yeah, but like whatever, you know. And it's like it's the spirit of the thing, you know. So yeah.
I did want to say, and we didn't mention it, that these films, it's important to remember, were released with no internet, with no cell phones, with no digital technology, with no DVDs, with no ability to buy the film. You couldn't see it again if you didn't see it in the movie theater. So you had to see it in the movie theater. There was no home video. So it's a different world where there was a larger excitement about films because you had to see it in the 2 weeks, or you would wait maybe 3 or 4 years until it showed up on television. Whole different world.
And on the home video front, for someone like me who has always been sort of drawn to posters and movie art and that sort of thing, like, you know, when I would be a kid going to the video store and like scanning covers or whatever, you know, these ones always sort of spoke to me. I'd be like, oh, okay, that one looks like there's a lot going on in there. Whereas, you know, the later movie posters where there's just like a face is kind of like, come on, you know, that's not doing it for me. So I think like that's part of another way that these movies would get rediscovered is, you know, in the video store, you know, you're looking to have a fun time and these movies will deliver. So, yeah.
We didn't mention, Adam, that all of these posters have illustrations of human beings, not photographs. So I've always thought that photos, we all can see what people look like, but illustrations are an interpretation of what someone looks like. So it heightens the imagination, and an illustration is art. Not that a photo isn't. We know that photos are beautiful and they're art, but it's a decision to make life even more heightened than a photograph, to draw women fighting, or to draw a woman with a shotgun, or to draw a thing with two heads, right? They could have taken a picture. He has two heads in the movie.
Right.
But a decision was made that artwork better represents what the film is about.
Great point. Anybody else?
So before I get my outro, did you all want to say anything else, or do you feel good? Closing statements?
Oh, wow.
Ooh, Adam?
No, it's fine. I just, I guess if I have a closing statement, it's just that I appreciate you all being here and for asking such great questions and for having an open mind about this exhibit and these movies and us. And I want to thank you too for being willing to sit down with me, even though we're not related.
We don't know that. We have to do that.
Could be,
We have to
you
do
never
that
know.
background check, right? Thank you so much for coming out. We appreciate it. Events like this happen all the time and no one shows up. They still go on, right? We would still be here, but we are very appreciative of you coming out. You didn't have to. It's Friday night. We thank you very, very much.
I borrow your mic?
Please.
Thank you. Well, Adam and Josiah kind of stole my outro. So if we could just give them one more round of applause. I think that this is a fantastic return to our in-person public programs, and thank you all so much for being here. And I just wanted to say that we will continue to be offering both in-person and virtual programs as we move forward, including First Friday, which is our newest public programming initiative, where we will be screening a matinee screening of Coffee on October 1st. So if you have not seen it yet, please do stop by. And you can see all of our upcoming exhibitions and events at posterhouse.org/events. And sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear of these things. Yeah, and if you can't get enough of Adam, he will be doing a public tour on the first Friday in November. So thank you all again for coming. For spending your Friday evening with us.
Should we hype the Nighthawk thing too, or is it too soon to do that?
You know, I thought it was too soon, but since you brought it up.
Sorry.
Please.
Yeah. Oh, just that we will most likely be screening Foxy Brown at Nighthawk on the 11th, is that
November 11th.
November 11th, with live music performed by Morricone Youth. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they do live scores and things of that nature, so, and I'll introduce the movie for y'all. So I don't think tickets are on sale yet, but when they are, you should be on the lookout for that.
Mm-hmm. And you can sign up for our newsletter to be the first in the know.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you all once again.
Thank you.